everyone could please sit down. We are starting soon. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Awesome. Hello all. My name is Lachlan Duncanson-Hales. My pronouns are he, him. I am a climate motivator for the United Church of Canada, and I'd like to welcome you to Solutions and Pathways. Before we begin in fashion, I wanted to just take a moment and just acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabe, part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. Now, today is a day of action, or a call to action. The climate clock is ticking down below 5 years for the first time since its inception, and it's signifying that we are running out of time, or more running out of time to take significant action. However, in light of that, today's more than just about the threat of climate change and the climate crisis. It's also a day of showing that there's hope, that we are on the right path, and that with that being on that path, we just need to be accelerating it, taking those steps further. With climate change and the climate crisis, it's not just an environmental issue, it is also a humanitarian one, as the people who will be feeling its effects the first and feeling it the strongest are those who are the most vulnerable in our society. Homeless, people who are dealing with addiction, such like that. With that being said, I would like to introduce our first speaker from the Climate Risk Institute and its president, Al Douglas.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to speak at this event and discuss a bit about the impacts and adaptation side of the climate change equation. An important one, as you may know, in the response to climate change, and one that we are recognizing more and more that we need, particularly significant amounts of adaptation and resilience as we experience the impacts of climate change. So in the presentation, I'm going to speak specifically about the provincial impact assessment that was done here in Ontario. Our organization led that, and it was conducted a couple of years ago over a 2.5-year period. Give you some of the details, talk about the methods, and then a few words about responses and adaptation and the way that all of that is framed within the context of the work that we did. Next slide, please. Quick word about the Climate Risk Institute. We've been around since 2019, and we provide adaptation and resilience services in these different areas. We're an academically affiliated nonprofit organization, and we conduct our work in Canada as well as other countries around the world in places where those capacity constraints are considerably more than what we experience here in Canada. Next slide, please. I don't need to say too much about this graphic. You could probably tell me a lot more about this, but in the context of the degree of change and the degree of emissions that we've already put in the atmosphere, we have a resilience deficit at this point in time. We're behind when it comes to our ability to respond to the impacts of climate change and the types of extreme weather and hazards that we're experiencing. And we know that kind of will change in balance with what we do to reduce emissions going forward. And so if we have a deficit now and we continue to go more slowly with respect to reducing emissions, adaptation needs are going to become that much more significant as we approach the middle of the century, and extraordinary adaptation needs by the end of the century for our children and our grandchildren. So resilience and adaptation are hand in hand with mitigation and what we do to reduce emissions, and that's critically important. Next slide. So the impact assessment, it started in 2020. It took about 2.5 years to complete this study, and it was really to establish a risk baseline. We needed to know where we're at with respect to emissions, with respect to impacts, and with respect to risks, so that going forward we have something to measure against to understand how things are changing, how is society either more resilient or more at risk to the ways that climate is changing. And that work was meant to inform decisions that we make right now, so policy decisions as well as the actions that we all take as individuals and policies and programs to respond to climate change, so that we have resilient people, resilient ecosystems, resilient infrastructure in cities. But it's also about the path forward. It's about into the future, so that we make smart decisions now, knowing that things are going to continue to change, and this is the trajectory that we're on, and these are the ways that risks are expected to increase into the future in the context of climate change. They also asked us to make sure that the process was scalable and replicable, and that was a bit encouraging, because they see the approach that we took and the methods that we created and followed to be ones that could be adopted by watersheds or cities or sectors of the economy who want to dig a little bit deeper into the risks that they face with respect to climate change. And replicable is even more important, because that to me signals a sense of, we need to do this again. We need to continue to have this iterative process so that we reevaluate risks into the future based on the degree of change that we see and the impacts that we experience. And of course, all of this is assessment, which is the means to the end. It's about adaptation and resilience, and so part of the study was to develop a suite of measures that we could take in different areas to help build resilience to climate change in Ontario, and that is what we need to be adopting and implementing if we're going to actually make a difference and reduce levels of risk into the future. Next slide, please. This is a couple of graphics about the study itself. On the left-hand side, we started with developing a list of 15 different climate indices or climate hazards that drive these risk scenarios. That was the work of the climatologists that we had on the team, and so they developed the data that showed how things have changed to date to establish the baseline, and then what those future changes look like in 2 time periods, into the middle of the century and to the end of the century. And on the right-hand side, the graphic, it may be difficult to see, but they're called areas of focus. So in essence, we needed a way to divide up all of the activities of society and economy and people in Ontario into these buckets in which we could do the climate change risk assessment. Those are listed on the right. And of course, they created some divisions for the province into these different regions under which we could report, and you see them. They largely follow census division lines in Ontario, except for the far north. So that's the overall context of the assessment. Next slide. Other important elements or ingredients, is kind of starting at the bottom. We engaged with people. We didn't just look at the literature, but we talked to people. We had extensive consultation. This is, as you recall, we were just getting into the swing of the pandemic, and so it made it a bit more challenging to engage with people, and we had to do some shifting, but it was the literature that we compiled, so all the articles and the reports and everything that we could find on impacts in different areas, and that was all compiled into a risk registry that I'll speak about in a minute, but we engaged with people. The other is to make note that it's, we do this assessment in the context of a changing backdrop, right? Things are always evolving, changing in society. You know, demographics are changing and population is growing, and all of those things are shifting, and they also, it's the layer of climate change impacts on top of that dynamic backdrop that we try to account for by including socioeconomic projections of climate change. Next slide. Each of those 5 areas of focus that I showed a couple of slides ago has this unique architecture. They have this unique structure of of level 1 and level 2 categories. And this was the first task that we had to sort out, is how do we actually assess impacts in all of the things that are related to, in this case, people and communities. So we constructed these tree diagrams to show level 1 in the middle and level 2 categories on the far right-hand side, to try to include and account for everything that exists in the province. Hugely challenging, and I can say that the one for, if you look at the report, the one for natural systems has nearly 20 level 2 categories. So you can imagine, the complexity of 15 different climate drivers or climate hazards, 20 different level 2 categories, 3 time periods, baseline and 2 into the future, as well as all of the regions of the province that we tried to do this in. So the complexity of this was fairly significant. Next slide. But all of that information came together into a risk registry. So imagine a large Excel database where we packed all this stuff in and did some quantification. So we had to look at the literature and understand the degree of confidence that we had in the information that we were looking at, as well as the degree of connections, as well as the consistency and the degree of agreement within the literature as it reported on impacts. And so all of that was tucked into the risk registry, and then we had to create a scoring mechanism that quantified all of this and rolled it up from level 2 to level 1 to an area of focus, to regions, and to report on in the entire areas of focus. Next slide, please. So this is in the report. It reports a couple of different ways. We have some graphics inside the report that talk about the results, and it's not very distinct. I mean, you can't go in there and look at we don't have a 1 to 100 scale, and you can look at exact measurements of what risk levels there are for each of those level 2 categories. We didn't get to that degree of granularity. It's very, very difficult to do that. So we had these broad categories, but this shows the narrative that occurs in the report, and this one speaks specifically to the impacts on natural systems, on ecosystems. And you can see that, as climate continues to change, there are pressures on ecosystems, there are pressures on species. They experience it firsthand, and it also affects the food that they eat. So there's food web impacts, and there's also impacts on their habitat. So those are critical components. And the risk levels are driven to high or extremely high, very high levels towards the middle and end of the century based on the different level 2 categories. It also notes that some of these species are irreplaceable. If you think about it, once these are gone or impacted to a certain extent and they're driven out of certain areas, they no longer return. And when we think about some of the things that we do to try to engineer or re-engineer these natural spaces to put them back into cities because we know the benefits that they provide, it just makes a whole lot of sense to be protecting them in the first place so that we don't have to do that and spend that sort of money, and it's just a kind of a level of craziness. But it's also important to note that, as I mentioned earlier about socioeconomic changes, these things happen in the context of our growth. And in the case of ecosystems, we continue to grow, our communities get larger, our housing and infrastructure occupies bigger footprints, and so that too has to be accounted for with respect to an impact in an area into the future. And we know that the impacts to ecosystems are fundamental to our health as well. This is foundational stuff. Protecting ecosystems actually helps with public health among a variety of other factors. Next slide, please. So these are what some of the graphics look like inside the report. Again, you can see those broad categories of kind of low, medium, high, and very high on the risk scales. They're driven by, it's difficult to tell you exactly what is driving any one of these specific impacts because there are a variety of climate hazards that drive the change. But you can see largely that they go to the high or very high towards the middle and the end of the century. Some of them are quite specific, based on their levels of exposure and sensitivity to the climate that we're experiencing. Next slide, please. I grabbed this graphic for the people and communities as well, just to give you show you some of the categories that are contained there and the scores that those have. Interesting to note that the Indigenous communities, and of course this is in the far north where it's primarily Indigenous communities, that population is severely hamstrung with low levels of capacity, but extraordinary challenges. You could imagine the degree of change that's happening more so in the far north and impacting things like transportation routes and the inability to bring supplies into communities and move people around from community to community. Those risk levels are fairly significant. Next slide, please. We also recognize in the study that the way that everything that I just described kind of presents it in kind of a linear fashion. It examines those single line risk scenarios, and we do those one by one, and it all comes together, but we know that society functions as a system. There are systems that function in society, and sometimes when you look at the impacts and look at the risks, we know that they will cascade through a system. And we were constrained to look at primary impacts. We couldn't go beyond that because it would have been extraordinarily difficult. So we looked at primary impacts, but we know that when a system or a thing is impacted or affected, there are trickle-down effects that occur down the chain, and those too are real and need to be accounted for. And so we developed these cross-sectoral themes, the ones in gray in the second circle, that are our attempt to look at the way that systems function. So if we use agriculture as an example, we start with primary agriculture and crops and vegetables and livestock, and that's the primary agriculture. But then there's the movement of those goods, the primary products, to processing plants, right? So there's manufacturing, or there could be manufacturing, there's processing plants, so there's transportation infrastructure that's involved, there's buildings and other infrastructure that are involved with the secondary, the way that we manufacture foods, and then there's the distribution of that to markets where we eat it and export, which was not a part of the study either. So when you look at that entire system, the food system itself operates in such a way that there could be impacts to primary agriculture, but there are impacts along the way to things like transportation and buildings, et cetera, that we need to account for. And sometimes when those risks intersect with one another, they amplify. It's more than just the sum of the individual risks, it's an amplification to create a larger level of risk. And so we couldn't quantify that in the study, but we knew that was, that's an important part, and something that we want to be doing is looking at taking a systems approach. Next slide, please. So now we're moving on to adaptation. So these are the types of responses. There's a specific report called the Adaptation and Resiliences Best Practices Report that the province has not yet released. But the themes that we combed the literature also to look for adaptation, examples of what it looks like. What are we doing in Ontario? Because we're doing some of this already to a certain extent, and we know what good practice is when it comes to resilience and adaptation. They appear in those different categories on the left-hand side, and some of the examples that I pulled from the community function and human health component of the study are listed on the right-hand side. You can read what those are, but I highlighted a couple in bold to say that it's a mix of different things that we need to build resilience. It's not just a single solution, it's a combination of things that are going to help strengthen the system and allow us to better handle some of the impacts that we're facing right now and down the road. Next slide, please. There's also a section on overarching adaptation. So we know that there are also some fundamental things that will stretch across all of those areas of focus that we studied that are good things to do, that are important and smart things to do to become more resilient to climate change. All of these appear in the report. I listed a couple, or I highlighted a couple in red because I think, again, going back to ecosystems, a healthy ecosystem is one of those fundamental pieces that we need to be thinking about. A wetland is much more than a wetland. It helps to mitigate flooding. It helps provide habitat for species. It sequesters carbon. There's multiple benefits that we gain from a healthy ecosystem, including the services that it provides to all of us, like clean air and clean water. So those are critically important. Next slide. I'll stop there. The URL, the larger, longer technical report is on the provincial webpage. You can find it under that long, crazy URL address there. But if you Google Provincial Climate Change Impact Assessment, you'll find the report. And if you do a little bit of digging, particularly on the Seniors for Climate Action Now webpage, you'll find a couple of the other reports that we issued as part of the study. So thank you. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Al. Just before you step off, something that we had a little bit of a technical hiccup with the slideshow, so like the first couple slides of your PowerPoint weren't available for people online. Your slideshow itself, the presentation itself, is that also available online, like the more kind of condensed, or is it just the full report?
You can have the presentation, distribute the presentation, or
Yeah.
attach it to the, however you're going to broadcast the.
Yeah, that's also what I was wondering, but thank you. Awesome, awesome. Now, that was amazing. So, thank you, Al. Now, our second speaker from Fridays for Future to kind of go over on-roads, Sophia. Come up.
Really quick. Okay, you can all hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Sophia Mather. I'm from Fridays for Future Sudbury. I'm also a part of a lawsuit with EcoJustice against the Ontario government for their inaction on the climate crisis. I've been engaged in climate activism since I was 7 years old, and one of the most recent things myself and my group have been doing is the on-road simulator, and that's kind of just what I wanted to bring you through today. I'm hoping to get audience participation. Trust me, it's not hard, but it definitely lets the flow go a lot better. So if it's possible to pull up the on-road simulator, I'll give a little bit of an introduction to what you're looking at, and then we'll play around with it. The on-road simulator is a representation of climate policies, the subsidization of different natural gases and things like that, and it shows how it affects the global temperature. And recently we've been going and inviting schools and kids around my age that are going to be voting in the upcoming Canadian election for the first time, and showing them how to navigate climate policies and how to understand exactly what it means when they see the word carbon pricing or things like that. So here it is. So I'll try and give an introduction while speaking into the microphone, but you can see there's a whole bunch of little toggles on the bottom, and they all have different words under them, different policies and actions we can incentivize in. And then at the top corner up there, with the different colors on the graph, that shows the different types of gases, oils, coal, and how the projection of those things work, including including electric and hydro. And then here we have the projection of the global temperature. In the next 100 years. So if we don't do anything, if we don't have any initiative, our global temperature prediction is 3.3. Does anyone know what the goal temperature is set for? Back there. 1.5, yes. So I'm just gonna ask around. I don't know if you guys can see the individual policy names, but what are some policies if you've heard of, or just like heard discussing in regards to the climate crisis? Anything on here you think? Okay, so yes, so more renewable energy and less fossil fuels. So look at how this affects the global temperature. That should be in the far corner. Maybe you can help. Is that renewables? So down 0.1. Oh. Showing here how. So investing in renewable energy, and then are you gonna do fossil fuels? What's going on? Okay. Um, okay, so what if we took down oil, coal, and natural gas? See what happens. Is that getting us fully to 1.5C? No. But it did bring it down. Okay, is there anything anyone's curious about? Okay, so reset it back and increase carbon pricing, and let's see what that does. A little. Okay, wow, that brought it down a lot. So we can definitely see that that brings down the global temperature. Okay, is there anything else anyone's curious about? Maybe something you don't recognize? Or? Okay, increase energy efficiency. Or both. Mom, you can go. So that brought it down 3. Is there anything else we want to test out? Okay, let's see what happens if the population drops. I think that's if the population goes up, So if the population goes down, that's less people, less carbon footprint. Yeah, and if you are curious about population and you don't really understand what it would mean if the population dropped, right next to population there's 3 dots, if you can click on that, and then we can see what exactly that implies. Okay, I can't read this. So if you open the on-road simulator later on, if you're curious about what the policy dropping means, you can look into what that is and then an individual graph that would explain it more. So there was someone who said electrification, so we can try that one next. Yeah, just hit the X. Yes. Okay, let's see what happens when we increase electrification, right? Or what does it say? Let's electrify transport as well. Wow. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that nothing really? Yes. Yes. So in summary, the source of this electrification does come from oils and gases and things like that. So it doesn't exactly get us off of non-renewable energy, and it doesn't create that initiative. But it is important in the future once we do things, such as things that drop the temperature. Are there any other things we want to test out? Are we going to try and get it to 1.5C? Okay, technological and carbon dioxide. Oh. Sorry, Okay, so we're so close. Do you want to decrease deforestation and increase afforestation? See what happens? Oh, it's not there anymore? Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, let's see what happens with agricultural emissions. And we did it. A round of applause for us. And there are many ways that we can get to this, and there are many ways that you can change the different policies. This is kind of an introduction, and usually at this point we would let the kids themselves explore. And you know, some people are a little more nervous to ask questions, or you know, like new carbon and things like that that they might not understand. As well, we've had kids that maybe weren't as engaged, but they've tried to increase the global temperature as much as possible as a joke, but they're still learning in the same way of what has negative effects and what has positive effects. And if you're curious learning more about this, it's called EN Roads, On Roads. And there are also other simulators that they've created, such as Sea Roads, where you can learn how different countries contribute to the global temperature and how their initiative works and has an impact. So that's all I really have to share with you today, and I hope you check it out. Oh, is there another question? Okay, do waste and leakage down, if that's possible. Oh, wow. So before I go, if there's any other questions, any other things you want to see the impact of? No? Okay, yes?
What happens if you increase renewables and reduce coal, oil, and natural gas usage while keeping what we have on hand?
So what happens if we decrease coal, oil, and gas and increase renewables while keeping what we have here? Yes? Okay, let's see what happens with nuclear energy. Increase. So you can also see at the top corner there, like the amount of each substance is being used and kind of how that changes as you increase nuclear. It's not much. Are there any others? Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, okay. For agricultural emissions, could you click on the 3 dots? I cannot read that from here, but if you want to read that yourself, I'm really sorry. I don't want to step away from the mic. The text. Yeah, and this is accessible on any platform you want. Is there any? Oh, yeah, click on the 3 dots for waste and leakage as well, because some people are curious. Thank you. And anything else? Yes, and something that would be really interesting if, like, you're obviously curious about the global temperature, but right above the graph next to the global temperature, there are many different areas you can explore. One thing I found really interesting was like the economic stuff and how that would affect the cost of living for people, because that is a big concern, how it would affect specific businesses and places like that, such as agriculture. So we only brush the surface of how much this can go into. And I really hope that when you get home, you should check out On Roads and explore more and share it with your friends. And if they're curious about different climate policies, this is a great way to help people learn a little bit. So if there's no more other questions, I'm going to leave you with that. But thank you so much. And yeah, so.
Thank you, Sophia. So that was our final speaker, and with this event, my big takeaway with this is I really hope that you saw that the climate crisis is something that we should be concerned about. It should be something that gives us a small degree of anxiety or gives us a degree of fear, but we should channel that fear into trying to change things, into making things better. Because whilst it's a hell of a problem, and you can feel it, literally feel it in the air. I think it was like a couple weeks ago when it was the heat dome with parts of Ontario and parts of Quebec, and just feeling those record-breaking heats. For me personally, I was going up to the island to help out with just gardening and such, and like, oh no, I can't do that right now just because it's too dang hot. But there is a pathway forward. We've seen with On-Road, seeing steps we can take there. With Al's presentation, steps we can take there. There is a way out of this. There is hope. And again, that's what I want to reiterate, that while this problem seems big and terrifying and all-consuming, there is a way out of it. We have pathways forward. There are solutions and pathways. So again, I would like to thank our speakers for coming. I would like to thank St. Andrews for hosting. I would like to thank my friends Brennan, Mogg, and Connor Ross for running the tech booth, because without them, I don't think half the stuff we would be able to do. I'd like to thank Torin for providing support with stuff, for being an amazing sounding board. I'd like to thank my mentor for the Climate Motivators, Donna Meese, for being in my corner. I'd like to thank Kathy Orlando from the Citizens Climate Lobby for also being a massive support, and just to thank you all for coming. I was incredibly nervous about this, but I am, oh yeah, and also, I would also like to ask if we could just get a picture quickly before we completely wrap things up. But again, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending and everyone for coming. If I want the crowd over here so we can get a quick, oh, right, yeah, yes, that makes sense.